It seems like creatives always get a bad rap.
From childlike tantrums and ridiculous green room requests, to strange superstitions, and even self-mutilation, it's clear that artists have plenty of strange habits.
But they've also made a pretty big impact on the world.
Hi, I'm Kate Rooney.
And I'm Jess Guffey.
And you're listening to Creatives Are the Worst, presented by Design Pickle, the leading flat-rate graphic design and creative services platform.
In this podcast, we'll be uncovering the fascinating myths and shocking stories behind the artists we love, or in some cases, love to hate, as we try to determine, are creatives the worst?
Welcome to Creatives Are the Worst, presented by Design Pickle, a podcast where we talk about different creatives who have somehow changed the course of history and try to figure out whether or not they're the worst, because I think it's safe to say plenty of creatives have a bad reputation for being a little odd. I'm here with my amazing, incredible co-host, Jess Guffey. Hi, Jess.
Hi, Kate Rooney. How's it going today?
It's great. I took today off, aside from recording this podcast. So I'm living the dream. I walked the dog longer than normal.
A luxury that we cannot all handle on days where we're working.
I may or may not be in the same shirt that I slept in last night, but that's all besides the point, because I know that you have a person that you're covering today, and I'm so excited to hear who it is. I have no idea.
I'm really excited to tell you this story because it's like relevant to our recent encounters when I've actually been with you in person.
What?
So, I know. Where does that send your brain? Well, I don't know.
I would say it's been forever because of this pandy situation we're in, but I did get to see you not too long ago, so.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I hate being in your shoes right now because this could go so many different directions, and then once it clicks, you're going to be like, what the hell? So, if I say one sentence, I know you're going to figure it out, but...
Maybe not. I don't know.
Am I correct? Am I correct to say that we're both fans of the show Marvelous Mrs. Maisel?
Oh. The wheels are no way.
Your facial expressions right now are gold. Is it safe to say that, though?
Yeah, very safe to say. Very. Okay. That's the safest thing you could say.
Is it also safe to say that we watched the season 2 finale together when I was in Huntington Beach, California with you? Because you forgot to watch it by yourself.
I did. I watched all the way up until right before the season finale and then just forgot to watch the rest. We had a marvelous time watching that together.
It's cute. Is it also safe to say that the show pulls influence from real-life people to show in the fictional show?
Well, there's a few that I know are real. The wheels are turning, and I... Just tell me.
Is it also safe to say that Midge Maisel in the show is friends with the very popular, very real, dun-dun-dun-dun, Lenny Bruce?
Oh, my... Oh, Lenny Bruce. I just got goosebumps. I get goosebumps every episode, I feel like, but I'm also picturing the actor who plays Lenny Bruce, and I just loved him in the show. But I also know
won an Emmy. Fun fact.
Oh, he did. Good for him.
Mm-hmm. For that role, not Lenny Bruce in real life.
I didn't think so, but. Oh boy, I don't know anything really about his background, but I know a little bit about his tragic fall. So, yeah.
So first of all, I mean, we love the show. We've stated that, but I think for me, I realized that once I saw him on the show, his influence was much bigger than any of us realize today. And it's not necessarily something that you grow up knowing, right? Like, you see all these comedians that are famous in our time, but you don't necessarily put the dots together that they were inspired by Lenny Bruce. And once I started researching, I was like, I have to do this person. I mean, we love comedy. You and I are such big comedy geeks. And I think once you hear his story, you'll be even more so like, how is this not a story that every single person knows if they're into any sort of comedy? And it's rare that we...
I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's rare that we talk about a person's influence at the top of the episode, but I think it's worth noting his significance just because his story isn't as well known. So if you don't know, Lenny Bruce has inspired just countless pop culture references, biographies, works of art, etc., etc. Obviously, we mentioned Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which is a very popular show by Amazon Prime. But just to name a few of my favorites that I stumbled upon in my research, he was also portrayed in a Bob Fosse film by Dustin Hoffman. There was a Broadway play about him. Fosse's personal autobiopic featured Lenny Bruce as a character. There's a documentary about him narrated by Robert De Niro. He was featured on the cover of a Beatles album. He's referenced in lyrics in multiple songs, including It's the End of the World as We Know It by REM. There's a reference in The Nutty Professor by Eddie Murphy referring to him. There's also a beer by Schmaltz Brewing Company called Bittersweet Lenny's RIPA, and the tagline is brewed with an obscene amount of hops. Like, these are just my favorite ones that I've stumbled across, but I don't think I ever realized ahead of time that like the reach is that significant.
The first thing that I thought of, because you and I are both big fans of Conan Needs a Friend. Conan O'Brien is just our hero. We love him so much. But they talk a lot about different comedians and who they're inspired by. And I'm sure almost every, full-time comedian, that's a weird thing to say, they all probably know who Lenny Bruce is, but I had never heard of him until Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Same.
And he's a big part of that show. I mean, obviously, like, Midge, the main character, she wouldn't, like, continue in her career and become this famous comedian if she hadn't met Lenny Bruce. And obviously, that's all fictionalized, but I think it kind of, well, I'll let you tell the story. How about that?
No, but it's true. Like, I feel the same way. I didn't know until I was watching with my mom. She was like, Lenny Bruce is based on a real person. And I was like, wait, what? And then I just kind of went down a rabbit hole. And then when we started this podcast, I was like, I have to cover him because this story needs to be out there more. But it's really interesting. You'll find out why, but he really did change the landscape for political humor, satire, comedy. He paved the way for people like John Oliver, Trevor Noah, all of these people that we're like dying laughing at today with their satire. He really is the one that started all of that back in the 50s and 60s. So it's important to know. And then on top of that, I mean, we've referenced Conan O'Brien, but there's so many comedians that actively have cited him as their inspiration. All people we know: Margaret Cho, Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, Robin Williams, Louis C.K. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. So way bigger influence than I personally ever knew or gave him credit for. Not intentionally, just didn't know.
How'd you know? Yeah.
How would you know? So with that said, we jump into his story. So Lenny Bruce was born Leonard Alfred Schneider in 1925. His dad was a shoe clerk, and his mom was a dancer, performer, MC, comic. She was just in the performing world. She had the bug.
So we already have parents who are creatives to start with. Performance parents.
Correct. Stage parents, if you will. So his parents divorced when he was 5, and he was living with his mom, raised by various relatives, and his mother, but there are a lot of people in and out of his life. And I think this is important to note because his mom was a very influential figure in his life throughout, and especially with performing. I mean, she had the bug, kind of caught on with him. You'll see why in a bit. So, like any kid in the 1940s, Lenny dropped out of school at the age of 16 and ran away from home.
Oh, no.
No idea why. He just did it. And he started working on a chicken farm. And he was driving trucks, working on a chicken farm, doing that manual labor business. Really didn't like it.
Wait, I'm sorry. So, where was this?
This is New York.
New York, okay.
Mm-hmm. So, like many young men, in the very next year, in 1942, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served abroad in World War II. So he was in Southern Europe, Northern Africa. It's really sad. I hate when we have to talk about the war times in this podcast, but when he was on his vessel, he witnessed 40 airmen floating by his vessel, deceased, and traumatic stuff like that. I mean, it's not easy to talk about, like I said, but important for their stories nonetheless. Mm-hmm. So Like many young soldiers at the time, while they were fighting a war, they did have a lot of free time. So he started performing for his shipmates to make the time go by faster. And I feel like you hear a lot of stories of that from those times, right? Like a lot of famous people that went through war and then became famous afterwards, you hear about them performing for their colleagues. Lenny was no exception. He ended up getting a lot of laughs. People were really enjoying his sets, but he hated being in the Navy. He just absolutely despised it. So Lenny, being the little schemer that he was, created an elaborate ruse to get discharged.
No way.
He's like, what can I do to get the hell out of the Navy? Don't want to be here anymore. What can I do? What's the biggest offense without being killed? So he started performing in drag to his shipmates, and not surprisingly was caught by his commanding officer, who, again, not surprisingly for the 40s, was not thrilled to see Lenny performing in drag.
I mean, that probably still wouldn't go over well today in the military, but like any other location that's like, what's the big fuss? He's
right.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Wow, but it was schemed. It was schemed.
Yeah. He came up with this on his own as a way to get discharged. So then, of course, back in those days, they brought him to the medical staff and they were like, something is wrong with you. And he convinced the medical staff that he was having, quote, homosexual urges. Okay?
They're like, here's your ticket out of the military. Get you out of here. Oh, jeez.
That's actually what happened. So he was dishonorably discharged. It worked. And it was later appealed to be under honorable conditions because, you know, we're much more accepting nowadays. But this whole story became so famous that it inspired a character on MASH, the character Klinger.
Never seen an episode of that in my life.
I've seen a few. It used to be on after a sitcom in the 90s, and I don't remember which one. But regardless, like, it became so well known at the time that this is what he did that it actually inspired a TV character. So yet another pop culture reference under Lenny Bruce's belt. But that story made me laugh. I think it just kind of shows his little sneaky personality and how he's always scheming and, you know.
And not caring, because you think like the machismo of the time, especially in the military, that's like everyone's biggest fear is being seen as, you know, feminine or anything. And he's like, I don't care. I want out of here. Like,
Doesn't
out of anything you can... I almost would say, because I'm an expert on the topic, but...
Naturally.
No, I'm not. But I would almost argue that, like, most people would be like, I'd rather kill someone than tell people that I'm gay or dress in drag at...
100%. 100%.
He's ahead of his time, for sure. Wow.
So, in way more ways than one. So in 1945, he's officially discharged dishonorably, and he returns to the U.S., lives with his mom, and then, if you recall, his mom was heavily involved in showbiz. So Lenny kind of goes down that path, and fun fact that I want to insert here, Amy Sherman Palladino, who's a creator of Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, used to hang out with Lenny's mom in the 60s because her dad was a stand-up. So they cross paths, which makes total sense of why he's in the show. Like, obviously he's influential, but I just thought that was really, really cool.
That's amazing. Yeah. Who would know that?
Yeah.
Like, where'd you even find that information? That's crazy.
Hashtag fun facts. Deep, dark interwebs told me that information. So Lenny's hanging around his mom. He served as the master of ceremonies at the nightclub where she worked. And through this, like, he was experimenting with ad-libbing because he could really do whatever he wanted. And then he kind of got the bug. So he started participating in amateur nights in New York, New Jersey nightclubs, and started, as any stand-up comedian does, he started with impressions, he started with parodies, one-liners, you know, like, not the simple sense of humor, but more attainable. It doesn't take as much prep or joke writing.
Well, and that was more the style of the time.
Exactly.
All of those things. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's important to note that as he became more comfortable, he started experimenting more and more with black humor. So Lenny's style really became, and you'll see this throughout, but he was criticizing social and legal establishments, organized religion, moralistic attitudes towards sex and drugs. You know, other comedians at the time were talking about like how terrible airplane food is and how their wives nag at them and all these just surface level things.
I was going to say, it's all about like, my wife doesn't make my sandwich.
Exactly. Or she puts too much mayo on my sandwich. How dare she? God.
Insert canned laughter.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
So he went the completely different direction and was talking about like teacher salaries and how it's a travesty that they make less than showbiz celebs, and then cruel abortion laws, racial injustice. Weird that we're still talking about some of this stuff today, I'm just gonna say. Also talking about the double standard between illegal and prescription drugs, and like these were things that, again, this is the 40s, 50s, like no one's touching these topics. They're so taboo. It's so like, we have to put on the perfect front of being housewives and perfect husbands that go to work every day. Like, this is not the type of comedy that people were looking for. But he did it.
Now, I know you're going to get into this, but one of the things that popped into my mind is how lonely that is, because everyone's talking about the very safe things, and like, where is he coming up with this? Right. Like, obviously it's things that people are thinking about, but no one's discussing, and he's going to be brave and talk about it. But man, that's lonely.
Yes, it is very lonely, and I think we'll see themes of that throughout. But I mean, we can say the same for a lot of the creatives that we cover. They're so on a different level, and for him, he was so ahead of his time. And it's like, how do you even get there? And how do you do that with what you're given at that decade or that time period and what's being shoved in your face with the media, you know? Mm-hmm. So his creative process was interesting to get to this point too. He would rework a bit hundreds of times before he felt like it was good to go, but it was never done the same way twice. So like, he'd do a bit one night and then he'd rewrite it for the next night. So it was the same general idea and he was getting the same point across, but it was a completely different delivery. And I think that's really cool because, I mean, we know that musicians are like that. And like, it has to be perfection before they put it out into the world. But think about that from a comedian standpoint, having to do that every single night if you're performing multiple nights in a row.
Well, I think there's a whole thing about performing on a stage, and yeah, you can just regurgitate the same things you've said over and over again, whether that's music, comedy, I don't know, business, keynote speakers. But I don't know if this is why he did it, but I think there's something so key to like reading the room.
Yeah.
I mean, playing off the audience, and those are the best shows you go to. It's not just the canned response, totally. the same thing over and over again. It's like, I'm going to react to how the audience is reacting. It's never going to be the same. No audience is the same.
I mean, we're getting on a tangent here, but I don't care because I think it's really important. I think he was so far ahead of his time, and I think a lot of the people that we cover on this show, that was kind of like their downfall to some degree because they were so far ahead of their time. But I also think, to a certain extent, the people are ready for that. Like, they become these famous people for a reason, and they're thinking of things that other people have yet to even, it's not even a blip on their radar, you know? And they're putting it out there bravely and courageously and all these things and like confidently and sticking to their conviction, and people are like, wait, you're right. Racial injustice is a real thing.
Oh, wait a minute.
Like, we should be talking about that. So It's fascinating. So Lenny once said in regards to his style and, you know, the type of material he was covering, he said, "It is impossible to label me. I develop on the average 4 minutes of new material a night, constantly growing and changing my point of view. I'm heinously guilty of the paradoxes I assail in our society."
Wow. Painfully.
Very insightful. Painfully. I also love the word heinous. I think that's so perfect in this quote.
Heinous.
It's so good.
Go Lenny.
It's perfect. Anyways, shortly after he starts performing, he changes his name, or his last name, to Bruce, and performed his first paid stand-up routine in Brooklyn in 1947 for $12 and a free spaghetti dinner.
Oh, well, I would do anything for a free spaghetti dinner. Does it come with breadsticks? Because
unclear, but I would do less money if I got more breadsticks, you know? So 1948 can be the year that we consider his big break, essentially. It was pivotal for his career growth because he performed on the TV show Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts. Big deal at the time. I've never heard of it, but again, very different era. I'm sure it was big. There weren't as many channels. So this is kind of when he started becoming Lenny Bruce. Like, he was starting to become a legit person in the comedy world. So we flash forward a little bit to 1951. Lenny had many romantic encounters, but he finally married someone, and her name was Harriet Harlow. She was... Do you want to guess what she was?
Wait, I still just can't get over how I love that name. Harriet Harlow? I'm going to guess she was a sex worker?
Yeah, she was a stripper. Very good guess.
Okay.
So she went by her stage name Honey, but she would also perform under the name Hot Honey.
Honey Harlow. Wait.
Harriet Harlow was her real name. She went by Honey.
Harriet Harlow Honey. Okay.
So she was known as Honey. And
is that what the hit movie with Mariah Carey, Honey, was created after? No?
Perhaps. I actually don't know. She wrote a book, so potentially.
Oh. Okay.
Unclear, though. But just a quick sidebar about Honey. I mean, she could probably be her own episode as well, because she survived 6 abortions in her life. She was jailed at the age of 17. She worked the carnival circuit for a bit. She had a brief stint where she was designing her own clothes and was like a fashion designer. She managed a business. She then ended up performing on stage as a singer at some point.
Yes.
Like, all over the place, but whoa.
I love Honey.
Girl power?
Yeah, she's getting after it. Oh, she was an independent woman. Go Honey.
Exactly. Go Honey. So once they get married, they moved to California, and Lenny started, became a family business. He started performing at strip clubs and burlesque houses in LA, as one does in LA. And this is when he really started being able to support himself and his family with comedy. So, like, he was making some coin at this point, as the kids call it.
Is that what the kids are calling it now?
Probably not. They probably have a way cooler term. But Honey would sing on stage with him. It became like this cute little act where they would perform together and whatnot. And other activities they did together. Heroin was one of the other activities.
I thought you were going to say something so much more wholesome than that.
Nope.
No.
Yeah.
Oh.
So they started doing heroin together, and just like not great. Not a great habit to do.
Bummer.
They also decided one day that they were going to come up with a quick little scheme, not surprising with what we know about Lenny. So they decided to steal some priest uniforms from a church.
Wait, what?
And it gets worse.
I can't get a... What?
It gets worse.
Okay, sorry, continue.
Yep. Nope. It gets worse. So in 1951, the same year that they get married, they get arrested for panhandling. Okay? Let's just let that sink in. And the backstory is they woke up one day and they were like, let's just steal some priest uniforms from the church by our house. Let's just go for it.
Why not?
And yeah, fine. Great activity to do.
Was there a reason why they...
I'm getting to that. Don't
Okay,
worry.
sorry. I'm so anxious about it.
So they started funding a charity in their priest uniforms, a charity in quotation marks, for a leper colony in British Guiana. Okay? Very obscure place. It's not even called that anymore. Yeah.
Papua New Guinea? No,
nope.
That's not the same place.
Nope, not the same place, but close. And, this went on. They received a legal state charter for this, quote, foundation that they were running. They were doing such good work for the leper colony.
How was there still a leper colony in 1951?
No clue. Unclear.
I thought that was biblical times here.
Me too. But it was later discovered that they raised $8,000 in 3 days, which Lots of money for that time in 3 days.
Well, that's
especially.
a lot of money now, Jill. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love to make $8,000 in 3 days.
Agreed. But only a third of that actually went to British Guiana. Do you have any clue as to where the other 2/3 of the money went?
Well, first of all, I'm actually a bit surprised that any of the money went to the leper colony.
Considering the priest uniforms were stolen? Yeah, me too.
I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and guess that maybe the rest of it went to drugs.
It went to Lenny's pockets. He claimed that he needed it for production costs and whatnot.
By production costs, does he mean drugs?
We're gonna allegedly drugs.
Who knows? Who knows? Who's to say? Who's to say?
If you know, let us know. Anyways, they weren't convicted after they were arrested, but just kind of, I don't love that story, but it kind of gives you an idea of where they were at as a couple.
That's a big scheme. That's not like a simple.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah. That's there's a lot more involved than just scamming people out of money.
I mean, they got a state charter to be a regulated foundation.
If you're gonna put that much work into it, why don't you just actually create a foundation or get a different job? I don't know. Hot takes from Kate Rooney.
Agreed. # hot takes. So 4 years later, they have a daughter named Kitty, and a few years after that, when Kitty's 2, they're on vacation in Hawaii, as one does. You do that. But
not in a long time.
Not in a long time. But while they're there, Honey gets arrested for possession of marijuana. She is sentenced to 3 years of parole. And when all of this is happening, they're dealing with the authorities and whatnot, Lenny flees, unannounced, doesn't tell anyone, goes back to LA with Kitty and tries to get full custody of their daughter, Kitty.
Just left his wife.
Left Honey. Who's like, bye. Honey, being very upset by this whole thing, broke her parole to follow them and had to serve 2 years in prison for breaking her parole. Again, what is happening? We don't know.
Oh, man.
Honey later came out and said she wrote a book eventually, which I actually want to read because sounds wild. Mm-hmm. She later said that she believed Lenny had planted the joints in her bag and alerted the authorities of her departure time from the hotel so that she would get caught. And the legal records, I actually read them, they show that the authorities were alerted that she'd be leaving the hotel with marijuana at the time that she was leaving. Conspiracy theory? Maybe, but...
Well, if Lenny hadn't previously gotten discharged from the military through his schemes and then also created a whole foundation that wasn't real, I would be like, no, that's ridiculous. But I wouldn't put it past him right now.
Agreed. She later said, if Lenny set me up, he did it out of fear and out of love.
Honey, no. And I mean, honey, your name, but also honey.
No. We can do better than that.
Do better. Be better.
Not surprisingly, they divorced a little bit after this incident.
Probably the best thing that could have happened, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah. So Lenny at this time, still doing comedy, he has his daughter, and he, in 1957, appears with Buddy Hackett on the Patrice Munsell Show. And one thing that I love about this is they called their comedy duo the Capital Not Ready for Primetime Players. Now, does this sound familiar to you at all?
Nope.
Well, 20 years after they coined this term for their comedy duo, the cast of SNL used the very same name.
I was going to just guess blindly SNL, but I didn't actually get the reference, so...
But it's cool. I mean, it's again, totally influenced the show that we watch regularly, and we had no idea. But fun facts. So a couple years after that, in 1959, Lenny had a huge appearance on the Steve Allen Show, which was nationally televised. It was a very big deal at the time. Again, they only had a few channels, so these things were really, really, really a big deal if they were live television.
And I'm on like my 10th streaming service for whatever reason. So
yeah, Peacock, world, I don't even know. Exactly. So when they introduced him, he was introduced as, quote, the most shocking comedian of our time. And this part cracks me up. They actually aired not just a quick, splash on the screen disclaimer. They aired a 4-minute disclaimer telling viewers to turn off their TVs if they did not want to be shocked.
Man, they would have lost their minds if they watched the Super Bowl halftime show with Janet Jackson. No one was prepared for that. 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's excessive. That's too much time. I mean, I'm imagining that it's just like text on the screen saying that with like some old timey music, like turn off your TV.
Or like I'm picturing the black and white professor with like the stick thing to point to a board, and it's like, he could be shocking in this way. Name the facts. He could be shocking in this way.
It's just Bill Nye on there telling everyone. Yeah.
Bill Nye, the science guy.
This is a super shocking.
Turn off your TVs.
It's Lenny Bruce.
Also, what made me laugh about this is like, TV ratings were just as big of a deal back then as they are now. Arguably bigger deal back then because, again, there were not Netflix and Hulu and all these other competitors. So, like, they're actively telling people to tune out of the show.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
You're losing viewers.
But also, there is, I'm sure there's some sort of psychological phenomenon, but that's like, if you're told not to watch something, it makes you want to tune in more. It's like that excitement. So maybe it made people want to tune in more. I don't know.
That could very well be the case. But moral of the story is, this time was when he was kind of really starting to be branded as like shocking, and Time Magazine called him a sick comic, and like all of these verbs and adjectives and like phrases were being used to describe Lenny. He was never just Lenny Bruce anymore. It was always the sick comic and the most shocking and all these superlatives.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And from this point on, he was essentially blacklisted from TV. If he did make a TV appearance, which he made very few in his career, it was always scripted ahead of time and had to be approved by the network before airing. Which, like, with people like Lenny, I mean, that just kind of stifles his creativity,
Yeah, I can't imagine he was very happy about that. Or, like, he just wouldn't do it because
exactly
that goes against everything he believes in, so...
Exactly. I do want to tell a quick story about journalist Paul Krasner. Now, Paul has written multiple stories about Lenny since his passing, but this one was from 1959 when they first met, and I just thought it was such a cool story. So they met in Lenny's Times Square hotel. He was in New York, staying there, and Lenny had subscribed to Paul's magazine, which was a satirical magazine called The Realist, and Lenny was like hyper-focused on why Paul was able to get away with the profanity in the satirical magazine, but he couldn't get away with stuff in his comedy shows because he had started using euphemisms to make it more acceptable and whatnot to the audience, so it wasn't outright shocking.
Lenny had, or...
Lenny had, yeah. So he could not wrap his brain around why Paul was able to get away with this so blatantly in his magazine, in print for people to read, and it was, highly distributed, whatnot. So Paul's response was, I cannot say this word, but I'm going to try anyways. Paul said, the Supreme Court's definition of obscenity is that it has to be material which appeals to your prurient interest.
What? Can you define that for the audience?
Let great question. Lenny produced a dictionary seemingly out of nowhere, like just produced it. He's like, let me Merriam-Webster, my good old pal, and looked up the word prurient. and looked at Paul and goes, "So, it's against the law to get you horny."
And he's like, "Yep, that's it."
Now, to define that word, prurient, it's having or encouraging an excessive interest in sexual matters.
Whoa!
So, like, salacious.
Salacious. Yeah. Okay.
Lustful, words like that. I had never heard that word before. I feel like you and I are pretty well versed in vocabulary words.
It's one of those words that I've, like, heard before, but I would never use. Like, I don't act. Well, clearly, I didn't know what it was. So. Let me try to explain away my ignorance. Hold on one sec.
I just, like, didn't know. So, yeah. So Lenny goes, "So it's against the law to get you horny." And I think that's hilarious. Like, he's putting two and two together. He's like, "So my jokes are bad and obscene because of this, but he can do that because he's not getting people horny." Like, that's their definition of it. Okay. So it's just kind of like a funny interaction, as you can tell. I mean, what are they really even talking about other than weird words and dictionaries and whatever? So as Paul's getting ready to leave the room, Lenny goes, "Did you steal anything?"
What?
What? And Paul pulls his own watch out of his pocket, puts it on the dresser, and Lenny looks over, and he looks at him, and he goes, "Ha!" and then kisses him on the forehead. And that's their interaction.
I'm extremely puzzled right now. Ha!
Kate's eyebrows are so close together. Paul literally recounted the story and wrote "ha." Like, that's what Lenny said, and exclaimed. But I just thought that was so funny. Lenny's going, "Are you stealing anything? Did you steal anything?" Lenny, you did a scheme on...
Wait a minute. You stole priest outfits, and you're... Okay.
Precisely.
You're concerned that this...
Yeah, like...
A prurient... Can't even say it. This person is going to steal your watch.
So, another kind of development in Lenny's content. He, around this time, those close to him said he would start to go over his performances in depth again, but this time he was trying to shape them into more like theatrical context. So it wasn't just about the bits anymore. It was like, how can I be theatrical?
He's growing as a creative.
Shocking. Okay. Exactly. And he was experimenting from show to show, which I think he always did, but it was becoming more and more pronounced. People were like, "Oh, wow, we're really doing this."
It's happening.
Okay. So even when the audience would laugh, like, this was at the peak of his career, the audience would laugh and it would turn into clapping because they'd be so excited, and they were like, "Wow, like, his creative process is just amazing." And he would ask the audiences repeatedly not to applaud because it broke his rhythm. Like, he could not handle when they would clap for him, even though it's meant in the best way.
Whoa.
Yeah. Which, like,
that's
to a certain extent,
he's there for the art. He's not there for the praise. He's there for the art.
Yeah.
And to inform people. This is just a whole tangent, but
go for it.
And it's probably because my lens of Lenny Bruce is from Marvelous Mrs. Maisel,
Yeah.
but I see him as more as like, yeah, kind of down on his luck, but good intentions, whatever. He's just ahead of his time. But then after hearing all these like schemes that he's done,
yeah,
it does kind of like change your filter a little bit, and to hear that he's clearly very tortured. He didn't want to hear applause or anything, but
nope.
I'm like, come on, dude.
Yeah, like,
you've done a lot of bad things, so
right. Yeah, I don't know. So around this time as well, Playboy wanted to publish and serialize a book by Lenny, an autobiography, and the name was How to Talk Dirty and Influence People, which is obviously a rip on a very famous book. And Hugh Hefner, of all people, hired Paul, our good old friend Paul, who Lenny kissed on the forehead, as the editor of the book because he knew they were friends, and he was like, this guy will do a great job. So Paul and Lenny met in Atlantic City to discuss the book, and I guess at this time, Paul describes it in his counts of this story that Lenny was acting very paranoid about everything, like extremely paranoid. And it was so insane that he made Paul take a lie detector test, but like unclear on what he was testing him for.
Yeah, for what?
Yeah, and because Paul was so confused, he was like, okay, like, I'm not going to lie about anything. Sure, I'll take the test. And then they ended up fighting because he wasn't doing it the way Lenny wanted him to. So Paul left and was like, no, I'm good. I'm over this. And then Lenny sent him a telegram saying in all caps, which is way funnier to read. Yeah, way funnier to read in all caps, but I will say it as it's written. Why can't it be the way it used to be?
Oh, no, Paul. Why can't it be the way it used to be? Ahoy, a telegram for you.
Ahoy, hoy.
Oh, my God.
Which, like, that makes me think of, like, a married couple that's going through a breakup. Why can't it be the way it used to be?
We say this in almost every episode, but I swear there are so many parallels to other creatives we've covered with the increasing paranoia.
Yes.
Once you kind of hit success and you're a wildly creative person, you start getting really paranoid about everyone. I mean, it seems like we saw bits of that with the whole watch kiss on the forehead incident. Now we're moving into telegrams.
Yeah.
I mean, what?
And lie detector tests. Yeah.
40 cents to send a telegram? That's way too much money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why can't it go back to what was it again? Can you say it again?
Why can't it be the way it used to be?
Oh,
I know.
Same.
And with that, we're going to take a break. Hey, Kate.
Yes?
Remember that time that we convinced our bosses to let us start a podcast?
Yeah, and you know what? We made it happen, but we had some help along the way. It's not as easy to start a podcast as I thought it was. There's a lot you have to do. You have to get the branding, get all of your thumbnails and everything done. But we have some help from Design Pickle.
Yeah, we sure do. And with things like the source files and unlimited revisions, unlimited requests, our smart designer match, it's been honestly a super easy process, way easier than if we were trying to do it ourselves.
Oh yeah, and we can even automate the process with the Zapier integration. So there's a reason why Design Pickle is ranked on the Inc. 5000 2 years in a row. And I believe we have a special deal for all of our listeners right now.
We sure do. If you are listening to this podcast and you need flat rate unlimited graphic design or custom illustrations, you can get $100 off your first month of any of our awesome plans by using the code WORST at checkout. That's WORST, all caps.
Woo! That is amazing. Head over to designpickle.com and use WORST at checkout, and you can get $100 off. $100 off any plan. It's amazing.
Any of them. It's a pretty big deal.
Get out of here.
We're back. So we're in the 60s now. It's the 60s, man. Lenny performs at Carnegie Hall. Huge audience.
Wow.
Yeah. And throughout this performance, or after the performance, people theorized that the more famous he became, the more he was prosecuted for saying really risque things, which, like, that makes sense. You're more in the public eye. You have a bigger target on your back, right? Like, that's no different with today's celebrities. So he keeps performing, and this is when Lenny starts having a lot of run-ins with the law. So,
because he didn't before with his.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's just more pronounced now.
Well, we see a lot of that, or how comfortable he is with getting arrested and dealing with all of that in Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Like, he's just like, I've done this song and dance before.
Second nature.
Ooh, okay.
So a few months later, he's charged with violating California's obscenity law at the San Francisco Jazz Workshop because he said the word sucker. And that's why the official reason why he was charged.
Wait, he's banned, or like he gets in trouble while he's in San Francisco performing?
Yeah.
That says a lot.
He's charged with violating obscenity law. Not just arrested, he's charged. So his defense argued that his comedy was not only inoffensive within the liberal jazz community in which he was performing, but it was also socially important. Like, true. I agree with them. Like, he's just being a little profane, but he's getting his point across. And the jury ended up siding with Lenny because it's San Francisco. It's fine. But by this time, he had a cult-like following of fans, and with, again, the fame, he had more police at his shows, which we started to see in Mrs. Maisel as well. Very accurate in there. And undercover detectives would literally hang out in the crowds of his shows and just wait for the moment that they could jump on stage and arrest him.
I cannot believe that. I mean, we saw it in the show, but the fact that police officers would just go to comedy shows or other events like that and just sit there and wait.
Yeah,
how wild.
I know. So things kind of continue to spiral. In 1962, he's banned from ever re-entering the country of England for the sake of public interest after he performed a controversial set at a club. And at this time, like, he had been blacklisted by more and more nightclubs. Like, he was just getting blacklisted left and right because clubs were like,
for speech, for language, for saying things out loud. Oh my gosh.
Because unfortunately for the nightclubs, they would like get their liquor licenses stripped. The employees would get in trouble. Like, it wasn't just Lenny getting in trouble. It was multiple people just for trying to put on a good time for other people. And Lenny said around this time, if I get busted in New York, the freest city in the world, that will be the end of my career. Like, he was very cognizant of the fact that things were kind of going south. He was also struggling financially at this time. And there's a specific incident in Chicago. He performed at the Gate of Horn where his paranoia resurfaces and is very pronounced, and he asked the entire audience at Gate of Horn to take a lie detector test.
What?
What are you even saying?
For what?
Again, no clue.
Are you lying about being entertained, or?
Yeah, like, are we good? Are you okay? Clearly not. So, not surprisingly, he was arrested for obscenity at this set, and the club's liquor license was suspended. Like, it was a whole to-do. But comedian George Carlin, who many credit as the father of comedy, who actually a lot of people don't know, but he was influenced way more than anyone else by Lenny Bruce. And
I mean, I believe it. He was all about the obscenities, and that seems to be Lenny's forte.
Exactly. So George was at this show, and he recalls the moment. He was sitting in the crowd, and apparently a cop like got on stage, arrested Lenny, and yelled "show's over" and kicked everyone out. They were checking IDs on the way out, and George was 25, but he refused to show his ID for whatever reason, just being a punk. So he gets arrested as well at the same show that Lenny gets arrested at. When he got outside to the paddy wagon to be arrested, legitimate paddy wagon, he runs into Lenny, and Lenny is like, "Why did you get arrested? What's going on?" And George tells him, "Well, I didn't show my ID." And Lenny said, "Don't be a schmuck."
My jaw is on the floor. The fact that George Carlin and Lenny Bruce were like having a little chit chat outside of a paddy wagon.
Yeah.
Wow.
And George has said many things about Lenny. Like, obviously he's his main influence, but one of the quotes I really liked was, he said, "Lenny Bruce opened the doors for all the guys like me. He prefigured the free speech movement and helped push the culture forward into the light of open and honest expression." Very profound, very true.
Man, that is so cool. To think back to when you were 25 and you don't know shit.
Yeah.
But like, you know, you have something, or like you're drawn to someone who has success already, and like he got arrested for it. Like, he knew, like, I want to follow this guy. I want to go down this path regardless of whether or not I'm going to get arrested. That's fascinating.
Agreed.
And then he, like, George Carlin's like he's the one that everyone now is like referencing and saying, I learned from George Carlin, but really he was a fanboy too at one point.
He learned from Lenny. That's where it all began.
Wow. So cool.
I also think we talk about this a lot, not to interrupt you, but we talk about this a lot, and I think it's really fascinating to me, the more stories we do, how many famous people's stories intersect with each other. Like, I want to make like a map of it because it's so cool.
because you definitely have time for that. Yeah. But it is like everything is really connected. Oh, well, it's just so many people are inspired by others who are changing the status quo or going against the status quo, and we don't want to like repeat ourselves over and over again, but there's definitely a common theme or thread between all these different creative people.
Totally.
And I feel like they can just relate to one another. So
agreed. And you know what just popped into my mind? The 5 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Maybe this still applies. Maybe we can find a way to make this apply with George and Lenny and all the other comedians. But regardless.
5 degrees of creatives are the worst.
Ooh.
Hashtag. Make that a hashtag.
So because Lenny was going through all this stuff at this time, and by stuff I mean getting arrested on the reg, and his performances started to revolve around the inequities of the legal system. Not surprising. Like, we could have seen that coming. And as you recall, he used to carry a dictionary and would whip it out whenever he needed to. Well, he traded the dictionary for law books and legal briefs that he carried around with him in his suitcase from venue to venue.
A suitcase. Yeah. Oh, if only he had a smartphone.
So much easier for you, Lenny. But by this time, he'd been arrested 15 times in less than the past 2 years. And it just, things weren't going great. It's like once the snowball started, it's kind of hard to stop
that sucks, though, because I assume that, like, almost the majority of those times he was arrested was just for just speech. Like, there's no freedom of speech. He can just get arrested for stuff he says on stage.
We'll get to that. I have some stats that'll be interesting. So in 1963, he's ordered by a California court to go to rehab. He doesn't. We go to the next year, and a pivotal moment happens where he's charged with after a performance at Cafe Au Go-Go, where he allegedly said over 100 obscene words. And this is when people claimed he was using shock humor instead of his like actual witty satire, because he was trying to draw an audience at this time. Clearly, he was already at his peak. He was kind of on his way down, and he was just trying to do whatever he could to get a reaction. But after he was arrested, the very next night, he was released. Very next night, he returns to Cafe Au Go-Go and performs again as like a, "Thank you, I'm back. I'm gonna do this."
Wow.
Yeah. But a lot of people in the creative industry, by this time, they knew who he was. He had already been super famous, and people like Woody Allen and Bob Dylan signed a petition to free him from these charges. And he was ultimately found guilty of obscenity and sentenced to 4 months in prison. But this was not without a fight. There were over 80 celebrities and academics that wrote positive testimonies to try to free him from these charges.
Do you remember what year this is?
Yes, this is 1964.
Okay, so we're in the mid 60s at this point. We're not quite in the 70s yet, but it seems like people are kind of starting to wake up to, I don't know, censorship and stuff like that. Like we're kind of like growing up as a nation and see that maybe we should stand up for this person who is changing history.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, and it's important to note too, I said over 80 celebrities and academics. There was a point in his career at the peak where people in the academic world, which are notoriously hard to crack, they have their opinions, they're highly educated, they do research all the time, but people in the academic world actually were very fond of Lenny because his opinions were so profound and so just like off the wall, but in a good way, for social justice and things like that he really had a lot of support from the academic world, which you wouldn't necessarily put hand in hand with a comedian, but here we are.
Wow.
Yeah. So as Lenny started to fall from his prime, which is very evident based on all these encounters with the police and arrests and whatnot, his drug use started to increase significantly, specifically with heroin. His money was still declining. In 1964, he made about $6,000 for the entire year versus 4 years prior, he made over $100,000, which at that time was significant.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wow.
So just slipping a lot. According to his friend at this time, his sets also, they deteriorated even further. So like we're beyond even just talking about his legal proceedings. His friend said His sets deteriorated into, quote, unbearable routines filled with self-conscious poetry about Adolf Eichmann and the injustices of the American judicial system. Unbearable routines from your friend. That's rough.
That's a bummer. Don't do heroin, everyone.
Yeah. Another article stated this downfall via curse words is ironic, really. Lenny ranted insightfully on war, government, law, injustice, sex, race, cruelties, and injuries, but the law stuck on his penchant for bad words, which we'll get to. We'll have a chance to talk about this, but that is true. Like, what is he really being arrested for other than having an opinion on the issues?
Okay, so I know that George Carlin has that famous bit about all the curse words you can't say. I'm dying to know what obscenities he was saying that would get him arrested beyond like the social issues words.
Yeah.
We obviously can't say them on the show,
No.
but yeah, it seems like a little bit of both. Like that's kind of the scapegoat is like, well, he's saying a bunch of curse words, but really he's saying things about society that are still issues today. So
Exactly.
he's definitely ahead of his time, but
Yeah.
that cannot get into the minds of many other people.
No.
We can't have that happen.
Perfect segue, because I just wanted to share some stats about his prosecution for obscenity over the years, because it's ridiculous.
Ooh.
So
Give it to me.
he was involved in at least 8 arrests for just obscenity alone, no other charges. He had 6 trials in 4 cities. It took 4 years combined and over 3,500 pages of trial transcripts. It required 8 state trial judges. These proceedings...
Great use of our tax dollars.
These proceedings engaged more than a dozen state attorneys and doubled the number of defense attorneys. It was comprised of appeals and petitions to state high courts, federal appellate courts, and the Supreme Court of the United States, in which 22 judges oversaw these cases. And for what? Like, these were to enforce laws that were constitutionally suspect in relation to free speech, and to invoke criminal laws in factual situations where it was not entirely clear that prosecution was required. All of that for a muddy gray situation.
He was onto something, though. You mentioned before that he talked about the judicial system and you know, the law enforcement, and that clearly, like, he was ahead of his time in talking about that. He had some personal experience for sure, but he knew that him talking about stuff isn't a good reason to get multiple judges involved and spend so much time and money on that. That is wild.
So I just thought that was fascinating, like the amount of resources and effort that actually went into all of this. I mean, it's ridiculous when you put it in perspective nowadays, but
he really, from a like higher level, if you just look at this from space, you would be like, yeah, he knew that was wrong, and they kind of proved his point in a sense to spend so many resources on this
exactly
for what? And he's still like, he's influenced so many people, so his legacy is carried on, but all of the laws against him did not.
Right.
So
wild. So in 1965, his autobiography finally comes out, How to Talk Dirty and Influence People. Such a clever title. I love it. In the foreword,
I love it.
I want to read a quote from his foreword. So it says, someone else is describing him. He's a true iconoclast. Others josh, snipe, and rib. Only Bruce demolishes. He breaks through the barrier of laughter to the horizon beyond, where the truth has its sanctuary. People say he's shocking, and they're quite correct. Part of his purpose is to force us to redefine what we mean by being shocked. The point about Lenny is that he wants us to be shocked, but by the right things, not by 4-letter words, which violate only convention, but by want and deprivation, which violate human dignity. So deep. Yeah.
Hold on, I wasn't ready. I don't know if I've said it enough, but today was my day off of work, and my brain was not prepared for that amount of depth that you just sprung upon me.
I've read this quote probably 20 times just in doing research, and it's just every time I'm like finding new nuggets because it's so spot on to describe what Lenny did. In the book itself, Lenny also says, quote, "I'm not a comedian and I'm not sick. The world is sick and I'm the doctor. I'm a surgeon with a scalpel for false values." That's how he saw himself. Which, like, I'm not going to argue with that for the time.
I wouldn't trust him with a scalpel, but it's a little, it's he's that fine line, as are many of the people we talk about on the show, but between you are amazing, you've revolutionized everything as far as not even just comedy, like freedom of speech, but also let's not get into God complex situations here. And you did some bad stuff. Not to say that you can't do bad stuff and still, you know, be a good person, but
accurate. Yeah. So, you know, things aren't going.
Wait, but this is an autobiography. So
he wrote that in the autobiography.
I would love to read that.
I almost ordered it, but I didn't have time to read it prior to this episode. I really wanted to, but add it to our list of pop culture things we need to.
It's on the list.
We need to subscribe to now that we're doing all these. As to be expected, I mean, things aren't getting better for Lenny at this point. He was already on kind of a downward spiral. He filed a lawsuit in San Francisco to keep him out of prison because he officially declared himself bankrupt, or at that time they called them paupers, which is so archaic. But he officially declared himself a pauper.
Wait, what are paupers?
Really poor.
Being bankrupt?
No money, yeah. Oh. At this time, he was also, we knew he was banned from England already, but he also is banned from Scotland, and he's almost banned from Australia. Not quite, but almost banned from Australia.
Banned from the country that uses the C word in a friendly manner? Okay.
Yeah. So in 1966, he gives his last performance at the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco, and shortly after, he passes away of an overdose from morphine. He was found on his bathroom floor, and on the same day, he had received a foreclosure notice on his home. Oof. And he had also been using heroin and meth regularly at this point.
Oh, my gosh.
Just, a bad combo, but they actually figured out that it was not a suicide. He had a kettle of water boiling in the kitchen still. The electric typewriter was on when they found him, and he'd stopped typing mid-word on the typewriter, and the sentence was conspiracy to interfere with the Fourth Amendment, and then it ends.
What?
So what did it constitute? Like, what are we talking about here? That's one of the most talked about things with him, because it's like, what was he trying to say?
I have so many questions.
Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, obviously he overdosed, like he was an addict, but it doesn't look like it was intentional.
He stopped because he didn't pass away at his typewriter. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so sad that.
I know.
I mean, we don't know. I'm theorizing here. It was either like he had already taken too much, or this is even sadder, that he had to stop mid-word to consume more drugs. Oh, no.
Yeah. So at this point, he had not served any time for his previous conviction from Cafe Au Go-Go, if you recall that one. But it was still really getting him down. I mean, he was just so upset that he was being charged over and over again by authorities. But he was survived by his daughter, Kitty, who ended up creating a foundation for drug treatment and rehab for people. Kitty.
Wow. Good job, Kitty.
Yeah. And after his death, police stopped prosecuting comedians for obscene language. And it really was a huge shift in comedy clubs becoming the greatest free speech zone. Like, you know, Lenny kind of took the brunt of all of this, and after he died, people were kind of like, wait, this shouldn't have happened. Like, we kind of drove him to do this in a way. One of the prosecutors in New York, where he was charged a lot of the time, and one of the prosecutors on his trial said, "We drove him into poverty and bankruptcy and then murdered him. I watched him gradually fall apart. It's the only thing I did in Hogan's office that I'm really ashamed of. We all knew what we were doing, and we used the law to kill him." Whoa. So, like, people took responsibility for his downfall, knowing that, you know, because he was getting arrested so much, because he had police at all of his shows, that kind of just drove him to use drugs more. And
talk about someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time at a high 100%. Level, because obviously he was ahead of his time, but he was also kind of in that weird cusp between the 50s, 60s, 70s where people were against everything, but then, you know, things changed so much at that time, and it was like law enforcement's still going to keep doing their jobs, but oh man, wow. Yeah. How crazy is that someone takes like responsibility to an effect with that?
That just shows how big his impact was even at the time, that someone would actually, you know, a prosecutor, like prosecutors are pretty important people, and for him to admit like, hey, we straight up murdered him. Like, he used the word murdered. So that just kind of changed the whole landscape. And in 2003, 40 years after his conviction that the prosecutor was referring to, the New York governor at the time, George Pataki, said that they were going to pardon him for his conviction because they realized that they needed to uphold the right to free speech, and that conviction on the record was not a way to do that. And Robin Williams was actually one of the comics and people that pushed for this pardon to happen for the sake of all comedians, because a lot of people felt like if this didn't happen, then they couldn't exist in the comedy world, you know, knowing that it was still on the record and it was still a thing that happened in the past that they could be, you know, charged for or convicted of or whatever. So Robin Williams pushed for that, and then they officially pardoned him in 2003. And then in 2004, he was named number 3 on Comedy Central's list of greatest stand-ups of all time. And it just kind of, he was one of those people that became more famous after his death, oddly enough, even though he was successful and, you know, he had a cult-like following and whatnot, he passed away. And then it was like the light bulb went on for people and they realized, whoa, actually he was a really important person in our lives.
Wow.
And now the question is, Kate, really hard one, I think, on this one, but was Lenny Bruce the worst?
No. I mean, he did a lot of bad things, but also when you mentioned the guy who said that he murdered him, like, I totally get why he felt so guilty, but also clearly Lenny had a very bad drug problem. He had an addiction problem, and that's not his fault either. I mean, that'll consume anyone. So a lot of demons, but heck, if Robin Williams sought for him, there's no way Lenny Bruce is the worst. Not a chance.
Not a chance.
What a crazy story. What a crazy life.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's no secret that, like, he changed the entire landscape of free speech and obscenity. Like, I mean, we talked about it, but after he died, people were like, oh, wait.
Oops.
Comedians should be able to joke about things and talk about the issues and touch on these hot button things that people are thinking about but don't necessarily say out loud. Like, if they don't, then who will? And like the political satire stuff, and I mean, all of it goes into free speech. And you know, the sad part to me is the fact that he was arrested in the first place for these things, where now you go on Twitter and every other person is making fun of politics.
Jess, we would have been arrested so long ago. Thank you.
So many times.
Thank you, Lenny Bruce, for making sure that Jess and I do not get arrested for the things that we say.
Appreciate you for that. But yeah, I just think it's wild. Like, that was his biggest pain point. He wasn't getting arrested for drugs. He wasn't getting arrested for murder or assault or any of these other things. He was literally getting arrested for obscenity. Like,
cops were waiting in comedy bars for him to say something. Wow.
Yeah.
And shout out to Kitty, man. Like, she sounds amazing. I want to check her out after all of this.
I do too. But in summary, I think Lenny, it's no secret, as I have said a million times throughout this episode, but so many comedians cite him as a reference and an influence and an inspiration, and he really did pave the way for them. I mean, the dirtiest comedians you can think of would not be able to perform without Lenny. So, really fascinating.
I can't wait to cover more comedians on the show, and then it'll all tie back to this episode.
They're interesting cats. But as always, these are our opinions of Lenny. If you have differing opinions, please let us know. If you have different facts, if you have different stories about him, if you know a comedian that was inspired by Lenny, let us know at podcasts@designpickle.com.
Yeah, lots of hot takes in this episode.
Lots of hot takes.
And while you're emailing us with all of the things that we said wrong, why don't you also just, follow this podcast, subscribe, send us a review. That would be nice. That would not be the worst. That would, yeah.
Correct.
But great episode. That was so much fun. My mind is blown. I want to go rewatch Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I kind of have a crush on the actor who plays him, but it was more because of the Lenny Bruce character.
It's pretty great. Anyways, tune in next week to find out if we're actually going to cover someone that is the worst of all time. The woat, as some might call them. We'll see.
The woat?
The woat. Worst of all time.
Well, okay. We'll find the woat next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Creatives Are the Worst.
If you like what you're hearing, or if you think that we're the worst, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love to hear from you.
You can also contact us directly at podcasts@designpickle.com, and a big thanks to Design Pickle for sponsoring the show.
Join us next week as we once again try to answer the question, are creatives the worst?